Hello there. This video is not about lemons, but about something that looks very similar. Here it is, similar because it has the same color. It's a late 80s mountain bike with 26-inch wheels and a steel frame. A bike how you can find them very often, especially in big cities, and also often for cheap money. And in today's video I want to cover all the things I want to recommend you to look at when buying a bike like this. So here for the video, the bike is in the exact status I bought it in. I've not changed anything so far, and I want to cover now the things I want you to look into before buying a bike like this. So first of all, the most important thing is checking the seat post, whether it's not stuck. Aluminium seat post and steel frame, they can melt together forever, and then it's very hard to get the seat post out. I would recommend to even ask this question in chat, so before even seeing the bike physically, to just make clear you don't waste your time by inspecting the bike and first thing is you find out the seat post is stuck. Maybe also check the stem, although there this problem is much less common as far as I know. This was also no problem here. Then I also recommend to check the whole frame, so for rust spots, for dents or even cracks. If you have severe damage you can see, then I would refrain from buying the bike. Maybe only buy it if it's very cheap and you want to use the components. You can sometimes even maybe hear rust inside if you move it a bit. So this would also be an indicator that it has rusted severely from the inside. Next to the frame, the wheels are the most important parts of a bicycle. And here with rim brakes I would especially check whether the brake surfaces are worn too much or have even developed cracks already. If the brake surfaces are very concave, it's an indicator that you will soon need new rims, and this might also be a big counter-argument for buying a bicycle. Here the brake surfaces are broken in, but they, I think, still have a lot of profile left. I also recommend to look at the spokes, whether some of them are broken or bent. Another thing I would check is the spoke tension. So maybe that's not essential, but if the spokes are very loose and are movable very easily, that might be an indicator that the wheels are not very stable anymore. These spokes here only move a slight little bit when I touch them, so I think that's fine. Some rims have eyelets around the nipple holes, and these might be broken sometimes. Here we don't have eyelets, but if there are eyelets, also check them. And finally I would check whether there's not an 8 in the wheel, so whether the wheel is still true. Looks fine here. There's a small untrueness, this can probably be fixed, but yeah, you have to have some wheel building expertise there. Then to some big weakness of these old frames, the derailleur hanger for the rear derailleur is a part of the frame, and if it bends or even breaks, the whole frame can be ruined. So please check it. Here it seems to be bent inwards a bit, but this can be fixed easily. But if it's bent, it can affect shifting performance. One more thing on the frame you might check is whether the fork looks somehow off. If there was an accident once where the bicycle was ridden into something and the fork was bent, this would be a clear indicator to not ride this bike anymore and don't use the frame. It would be a safety issue. One last essential check is the frame size. I don't want to cover this in detail here, how you find out your perfect frame size, but I would always recommend to check the frame size beforehand and then bring something on the spot to also measure again whether everything fits for you, especially the top tube and the seat tube. Of course, it doesn't have to be perfect, but the bike shouldn't be way too small or way too big. So now to some, let's say, optional checks, which can be helpful but are not essential. A sticker often indicates what kind of steel was used, and here we can see it's chromo double-butted tubing. Sometimes you see plain gauge tubing, and that would mean that the tubing is not of very high quality. Double-butted is usually a good indicator, so that the tubes are a bit lighter. What would also be interesting is checking whether things still come loose. So if you have the tool with you, to try find out if the pedals, for example, still come loose. It's not essential for the whole bike because you could change the crankset and the pedals, but it's also nice to find this out early. If something is really stuck in place, this can be a pain in the neck. Eyelets for bottle holders or locks on the frame are also interesting. There was 1 year, I believe, where they put 2 pairs of eyelets or screw holes on the down tube and none here on the seat tube. This is a bit odd, but I think it's still okay. Sometimes there's only 1 pair on the down tube and none on the seat tube, and this I would say is not so nice. Then I would also look for eyelets on the fork for fenders and maybe even a front rack, and also on the rear. So also here for fenders and a rear rack. Also upwards on the seat stays, whether there are the eyelets for fenders and rear rack. Mostly these are there, but I've also seen some frames already which don't have rack mounts, for example. You can also pay attention to the rear brake. Bikes from the late 80s often had these U-brakes, and some people really don't like them. But especially if they have this booster down here, this metal ring on the bottom of the brake, I think they are quite powerful rear brakes, and they also modulate well. Although they tend to limit tire clearance, which can be an issue, and they can make it harder to get the rear wheel out. Also, they need different brake pads than the front brakes, which is also not that nice. Speaking of tire clearance, make sure if you want to fit wide tires such as 2.3-inch tires that your frame will accommodate these. Especially with the U-brakes, sometimes tire clearance was limited quite a lot. So I think 2.1-inch tires would be the widest possible here. So 53, maybe 54 millimeter wide tires. I'm a big fan of thumb shifters. If the thumb shifters don't index anymore, as you can see here they still do, and with a clicky noise, then that might also be something to turn you off. Because thumb shifters are not that easy to replace, they tend to be quite rare already. So these here are still fine. Make sure they still move well. Oh, and a bell is always helpful as well. You know, in Germany you can get fined for 10 euros if your bicycle doesn't have a bell. We can see here that the cables are almost through, but this is something that's very easy to change. Also, this rust here is no problem. You can also check out if the brakes are still snappy, which they are here. Alright, some more words on wheels, especially the rear wheel. There were many changes during the late 80s to rear wheel standards. For example, 130 to then 135mm wide rear wheel hubs. Then the change from threaded axles to quick release. And also the change from freewheel cassettes to cassettes which were placed on the freehub body. I don't want to go too deep into the details here, and only say that I always recommend this kind of hub here, because with the other type of hub, the freewheel, the cassette can be very hard to remove because the chain threads it tighter and tighter over time. And also they are more compatible because you can change the freehub body in some cases and convert to 8-speed and so on. I also like quick release in comparison to threaded axles, as you can see here. And the reason for that is that I don't want to carry a wrench around me to remove the rear wheel whenever I have a flat on a tour. One last thing about wheels is rim width. I would opt for wider rims because they offer a much more stable ride feeling, especially with lower tire pressures and in corners. In the early 90s, rims tended to become narrower and narrower, and I don't like this trend. One last thing I would always recommend is going for a little test ride. Some things might not be obvious by only looking at the bike and can only be found out while riding it. And also just the general impression of sitting on the bike, especially with the geometry, is very helpful for the final decision. Alright, and with that we're coming to an end for today's video. Please let me know in the comments whether I've forgotten something very important that you think that should be included, or also maybe whether you think some details don't matter so much. Maybe you're an expert in getting stuck seat posts out. Would be interesting to know. Alright, thank you for watching and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye bye!